I am going to start recording. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation of the Chicago Map Society. My name is Curtis Wright, the MC for tonight's meeting, and I'd like to welcome you all and wish everyone a happy St. Patrick's Day, a happy March Madness, happy birthday to our dear friend and member Art Holzheimer, and a happy 3 days until the official start to spring. So we got lots of fun things to celebrate this evening, but none so more than our speaker, the eminent geographer and cartographic scholar, Dr. Ronald Grim. Before we get to that point, I will pass things over to our president, Jim Ackerman, who will do the official introduction. Just a reminder that tonight's meeting will be recorded. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions and answers, which can be submitted in the Q&A section through Zoom, the chat box, or if you want to go ahead and join the conversation, you can raise your hand in the attendee area, and I will give you the mic so you can share your thoughts verbally. With that, Jim, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Curtis. Good evening, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and echoing happy birthday to Art Holzheimer, who may be out there somewhere in the ether. Before I introduce Ron, I want to point out what you should see on your screen are the next two programs that are coming up this spring. Ron's is actually the first of a series of 3 programs that we are presenting related to the current exhibition at the Newberry Library, which I hope all of you will get a chance to come down and see, called Crossings, Mapping American Journeys. It's a introspection into the mapping of American travel in the 19th and 20th century, and very conveniently arranged like a map. Ron was along with Martin Bruckner, who will be our speaker next month, was one of our 3 advisors to the exhibition. And we had originally, when we planned this, hoped that things would abate so that Ron could visit in person. And as it turns out, things are definitely improving, but it was really too late to change our arrangements. So both of the next 2 programs, Ron's and Martin's, will be remote, but the Thursday, May 19th program will be in person. And Karen Lewis, who has produced a very nice video presentation as part of the exhibit on mapping the Underground Railroad, will be talking about that. And I hope that we will be able to have a gallery walk through Crossings led by yours truly as a part of that program. Let me now turn to introducing Ron Grim. Ron and I have been friends and colleagues for a very long time indeed. So I am indeed honored to invite him and to present him to you today. His talk today is at least partly based on a contribution he made to an online resource called Mapping Movement in the History of American Culture, which we organized and produced about almost 10 years ago now. It is currently under repair, but we hope to see it again very soon. Ron retired in May 2018 as Curator of Maps for the Norman B. Leventhal and Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. He assumed that position in 2005 after working 33 years for the federal government with the cartographic collections at the National Archives and the Library of Congress. He has been a member of the Board of Review for the Osher Map Library at the University of Southern Maine since the early 1990s, and he is currently serving as Vice President and Program Chair for our sister map society, the Washington Map Society. And I'm especially proud that he is a geographer. He received his master's and Ph.D. in historical geography from the University of Maryland. Ron is all this brief resume doesn't say all of what Ron has contributed to the field over many years. I don't know anybody who's done research and worked in the history of American cartography, at least, who hasn't consulted with Ron at one time or another. He is one of the most authoritative people working in that field and has been for many decades. He is also gifted with the ability to present scholarly information to general public. And in that capacity, both at the Library of Congress and at the Leventhal Map Center, he organized several wonderful exhibitions. And I can only just name a couple of these. Rivers, Edens, Empires, Lewis and Clark, and the Revealing of America, which he did for the Library of Congress in 2003. Beyond Boston and Beyond, a bird's eye view of New England, which was an exhibition he did in 2008 at the Leventhal Center. Eye of the Explorer is not an exhibition, but it is a pictorial book that he produced in 2010. He did an exhibition at called Torn in Two, 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and at the Leventhal Center in 2011. And then We Are One, Mapping America's Road from Revolution to Independence, which was in 2016. And then most recently, America Transformed, Mapping the 19th Century, which traces the growth of the United States as it to become a transcontinental country. That was presented in 2019. It gives you an idea of the breadth of his expertise. And I'm very happy to have that we'll have a small sample of it today as he talks about a nation of immigrants mapping American 19th century migration stories. Thank you and welcome to Ron. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Jim. And thank you for everybody attending tonight. Yes, I would love to be in Chicago to see the exhibit, but this is the circumstances we now have. Okay, migration. I'm defining migration in contrast to travel, since that is part of the theme of the current exhibit. But I'm defining migration as the process of people moving from one place to another to establish a new residence. And this has been a reoccurring theme throughout our nation's history. And maps are an essential source for studying this process. The questions that maps can address include where migrants came from, where they settled, and how they arrived at their new home. Okay, Jim sort of covered what's on this slide, but let me just reiterate. Based on my contribution to the Newberry Library's Mapping Movement in American History and Culture project, I have identified about a half dozen map types that can effectively document the geographical components of America's 19th century migration stories. Few maps portray the entire process, but by examining numerous maps, it is possible to piece together the complete story. Some maps show roads, railroads, or other transportation routes that migrants could have used. Others depict individual localities, helping us identify the migrant's place of origin or newly settled home. Tonight, I will first briefly review America's 19th century migration trends, reflecting the experience of many. And second, I will illustrate the selected map types and the stories they tell by referencing Native American, African American, and as an example of European migration, German American experiences. These examples, as you can see, are based on my previous exhibition and project research at the Boston Public Library and the Library of Congress. The United States is often referred to as a nation of immigrants. Initially, immigrants came primarily from Europe, Africa, and East Asia, and more recently from other parts of the world, including Latin America. Many migrated voluntarily, seeking better jobs and higher standards of living, while others fled political or religious oppression, and some escaped physical disasters such as drought or famine. During the 1600s and 1700s, most colonists came from England, settling along the Atlantic seaboard and in the major port cities. While the British dominated the political and economic structure of the 13 colonies, large numbers of Germans and Scotch-Irish settled in southeastern Pennsylvania and the backcountry from Maryland south to the Carolinas. From 1840 to 1880, the largest numbers came from the northwestern Europe, particularly Germany and Ireland, but also England, France, and Scandinavia. Germans settled in both rural and urban settings in Mid-Atlantic and Midwestern states, while many Irish settled in urban and industrial communities in the northeastern states. After 1880, the places from which they came started to change drastically. While the migrants from the Northwest continued to be strong, they were rapidly surpassed by those coming from Italy, Greece, and lands ruled by the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. The latter immigrants tended to settle in larger northeastern, mid-Atlantic, and Midwestern cities. There was also a sizable flow of immigrants from East Asia, particularly China. They settled in the West, working primarily on railroad construction and in mining communities. For others, however, their migration was involuntary. The two primary examples of forced migration were Native and African Americans. As Europeans colonized Eastern North America, with their settlement frontier expanding across the Appalachians, Native Americans were pushed further west. They were confined to reservations, first in the Midwest, then the Great Plains and the West. The dispossession of their tribal lands resulted from a succession of negative pressures, including disease, battles, treaty negotiations, land cessions, and military enforced marches such as the Trail of Tears. Africans were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade during the 1600s and 1700s. The enslaved were taken from Africa's west coast and sold to West Indian and Southern US plantation owners. They had little opportunity for further movement, except at the owner's discretion. The exceptions were those fortunate few who were able to escape to Canada using the Underground Railroad, which I think you will hear about in several weeks. There was also considerable migration within the United States. After the Revolutionary War, as the new nation gained control of the lands east of the Mississippi River, settlement moved rapidly westward across the Appalachian Mountains. The migrations occurred in three broad latitudinal bands, roughly paralleling the three east to west crossings that are highlighted in the new Newberry Library's map exhibit. As these textbook maps illustrate, migrants from New England and the Mid-Atlantic states moved into the upper Midwest. Those from the Chesapeake moved into the lower Midwest and upper South, and those in the Carolinas and Georgia moved into the Southeast. Following the purchase of the Louisiana's territory in 1803, the federal government continued to acquire and encourage the settlement of lands west of the Mississippi. By adding Texas, the Mexican Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest, the national territory reached the Pacific Ocean by mid-19th century. The discovery of gold in California and the construction of the first transcontinental railroad to San Francisco hastened by migration to the West Coast, whether the new migrants were residents from the older eastern states or new arrivals from Europe, China, or Mexico. Industrialization, starting in the early 19th century, encouraged rural to urban migration. The development of the textile mills in New England towns, such as Lowell and Lawrence, initially provided employment opportunities for young women from rural communities and for French Canadians. As industrialization expanded to mid-Atlantic and Midwestern cities, rural to urban migration increased rapidly. Following the Civil War, many emancipated African Americans remained in the South, but others started moving to the northeastern and midwestern urban centers, a trend that greatly accelerated during the first half of the 20th century. From 1840 to 1920, America's urban population increased from 11 to 51%, which can be attributed to migration from both rural and urban locations. Unfortunately, few maps were compiled or published that document individual migration stories or portray general migration patterns into and within the United States. We have learned, however, by gleaning information from the millions of personal stories, migration journeys can be plotted and documented using a variety of contemporary maps. Diaries, letters, and family genealogists provide the basis for reconstructing personal migration routes from which historians have been able to determine general patterns. One personal narrative that I have found particularly useful for identifying geographic locations and travel routes is an account prepared by John Parkinson, a 20-year-old man from southwestern Wisconsin. In his autobiographical account, published in a 1921 issue of the Wisconsin Magazine of History, he recounted his 3-year journey to the California gold fields during the 1850s. Parkinson did not prepare any maps depicting his journey, but he did mention specific places that he visited and routes and modes of transportation that he utilized. After discovering this account, I developed it into a class project for a historical geography class that I was teaching at the University of Maryland in 1999. As I briefly review Parkinson's account, you can follow his movements on these maps prepared by Jameson Thatcher, one of my students in that class. Parkinson and 3 other men left southwestern Wisconsin in May 1852. They left with 2 wagons and 8 oxen. They crossed the Mississippi River at Dubuque. They crossed Iowa. After crossing the Missouri River, they followed the Platte River through Nebraska territory. And at South Path in present-day Wyoming, they selected the Immigrant Road to California. After passing north of Great Salt Lake, they traveled through the Great Basin and Sierra Nevada Range, arriving at Sacramento River 5 months later. After 3 years of prospecting for gold in Northern California, Parkinson decided to return home. Rather than retrace his arduous overland journey, he returned by a water-land route, using the much shorter continental crossing through Nicaragua. This return journey employed a number of different modes of transportation. wagon, stagecoach, and boat to San Francisco, steamboat down the west coast to Nicaragua, wagon and steamboat across the isthmus via Lake Nicaragua, steamboat to New York, train to Chicago, and finally, stagecoach to home. Parkinson noted that the return trip took 3 weeks. He also remarked that when he made a return trip to California 50 years later by train, it took only 4 days. Parkinson also described his family's geographic origins and migrations, substantiating the general patterns that I just mentioned. His father's family was English, settling first in Virginia, then moving to Tennessee, and eventually Illinois. His mother's family was Scotch-Irish Presbyterian, coming from Northern Ireland, settling initially in North Carolina. They then moved to Southern Illinois, where his parents met. Subsequently, his parents moved to southwestern Wisconsin to take advantage of mining and farming opportunities. Now, using contemporary maps, such as those that are displayed in the current Newberry Library exhibit, it would be possible to plot an even more accurate map of Parkinson's travel. I want to illustrate this point by mentioning one that I was able to purchase for the Boston Public Library in time for our last exhibit there. This 1850 world map was compiled by David Burr and published in Boston, and it specifically showed travel routes to California. Now, I think this is the perfect map to illustrate Parkinson's movements. This detail, focusing on North and South America, shows the land route across the continent. It shows a water route around the tip of South America, and then it shows the combined route to the Central America, across Nicaragua, and back up to New York City. And as if to emphasize the importance of the crossing at Nicaragua, there is this inset showing Central America and showing the crossing at Nicaragua. Obviously, the more preferred route at that time than trying to cross in Panama. Personal narratives have rarely been mapped collectively, but one exception is the attempt to reconstruct the various routes traveled by enslaved African Americans escaping to freedom, a process known as the Underground Railroad. This map, compiled and published in 1899 by Wilbur Seibert, a history professor at Ohio State University, provides its first depiction. In commenting on his research methods, Seibert indicated that he created this representation, quote, by piecing together the scraps of information in regard to various routes and parts of routes gathered from the reminiscence of a large number of abolitionists, end quote. One such account was written by Josiah Henson, who escaped enslavement from Maryland and Kentucky in the 1830s. He subsequently published an account of his journey, which inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's fictional Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the home site where, with the plantation where he was enslaved, is just up the road from where I live, and it's just been turned into a county park. As Seibert map depicts, the Underground Railroad was neither a railroad nor followed established routes. Rather, it was a complex network based on many sympathetic people assisting enslaved individuals and families in their journeys to freedom. Because it was a secret and illegal operation, there were no contemporary maps depicting its full extent. If personal narratives such as Parkinson's are not accompanied by illustrative maps, how can we reconstruct the migration process? Fortunately, the three geographical components of migration into and within the United States can be studied with maps. Useful sources include maps of the migrant's homeland or place of origin, maps of general paths or specific routes they traveled, maps of places where they settled, showing landowners' names, or thematic maps aggregating statistical data. Well, none of these maps capture the entire process. They provide documentation of specific steps within the process. For many Americans with European ancestry, locating the specific town or village from which ancestors migrated is an important part of their research. Two examples, possibly useful for me trying to locate my Scotch, Irish, and German ancestry, are illustrated on the next two slides. Small and moderate scale maps, such as this 1777 map of Ireland, show provincial and county boundaries, major cities and towns, as well as primary transportation networks. Similar maps were published for most European countries during the 18th and 19th century. Larger scale, meaning more detailed, multi-sheet topographic map series were published for many European countries beginning in the latter part of the 18th century, as illustrated by this sheet from the Cassini survey of France, showing the area around Strasbourg near the French-German border. Early in the 19th century, similar series were produced for England and the Low Countries, and later in the century for Scotland, Ireland, Switzerland, Germany, Poland, Russia, and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. With the aid of contemporary gazetteers and geographic names databases, researchers can locate most cities, towns, and small villages throughout Europe. In determining how migrants arrived in their new locations, researchers would like to map their transatlantic voyages, locate port cities where they entered the country, and identify the routes they traveled to reach their destination. Numerous national and state maps show ports of entry and transportation routes. Such maps published during the last half of the 18th century show only rivers and major roads, but similar maps published after the introduction of internal improvements during the first half of the 19th century often distinguish between turnpikes, post roads, canals, and railroads. While there are a few maps illustrating specific voyages or general transatlantic routes, one outstanding example is Gotthold Zimmermann's 1853 map prepared for travelers to North America. It clearly highlights major land routes going to port cities in Germany, France, and England for those departing Northern Europe, and the transatlantic routes going to the major port cities in the United States. More common were maps published to accompany promotional travel literature. These maps often selected and translated information for more detailed reference and transportation maps to address specific immigration population. Some, such as Trogart Brom's advice book for German immigrants, provided a general discussion of immigration from Germany to various locations around the world, but with a decided emphasis on North America. Most of the narrative and the 17 maps pertain to the United States. The opening map was a general reference map locating major cities and towns in the eastern 2/3 of the United States. For more detailed reference, there were maps of individual states or pairs of neighboring states, such as Illinois and Missouri, providing geographical coverage of most states east of the Mississippi. In addition, there were maps of several major cities and 4 regional maps providing coverage of important destinations such as St. Louis and southwestern Wisconsin's lead mining district. Grimm, originally from Leipzig and Dresden area of Germany, traveled extensively in the United States in the 1820s and early 1830s, just prior to the beginning of massive German immigration into the country. He recorded his observation in numerous travel accounts published in the 1830s and travel guides published in numerous editions in the 1840s and 50s. One such example was the Handbook and Travel Book for Travelers to the United States of North America, published in several editions starting in 1848. It included this map highlighting the transportation network, which would be a very useful resource for immigrants planning their journey. The map's inset show the major points of entry: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, as well as a legend identifying the different modes of transportation: trains, canals, major roads. There are other moderate to large scale maps that help enhance our understanding of general migration trends, especially those that depict localities where immigrants chose to live. Specialized map genres such as state, sectional, or township maps, county land ownership maps, and insurance or real estate maps are useful for providing an in-depth understanding of immigration settlement patterns to both rural and urban areas. State township maps, such as this 1856 map of Kansas, were prepared for most Midwestern and Great Plains states to show the progress of General Land Office township surveys, usually on a yearly basis. By viewing a chronological succession of maps, it is possible to demonstrate how rapidly the settlement frontier moved through the state, generally in a westerly direction. But more intriguing, this map documents 2 additional stories: the forced removal of Native Americans from Eastern tribal lands to the Great Plains, and the potential expansion of slavery into the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Immediately evident are the pastel-colored squares and rectangles, identifying lands reserved for various tribal groups, documenting one short temporary stage of the Native Americans' migration history. At least a dozen Indian reservations were delineated, indicating that those lands were not open at that time for white settlement. In tracing the origins of these groups, most had been resettled here in the 1830s from lands further east, where their homelands became the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. However, as Kansas territory was rapidly settled during the 1850s, the native groups were forced once again to cede their lands and relocate, this time to the Indian Territory, eventually becoming the state of Oklahoma. Now, the other interesting fact is that this map was published in Boston, and that it was published by the same firm that published the initial editions of Josiah Henson's life story and Uncle Tom's Cabin. This hints that the map has another story to tell related to the expansion of Southern slavery. It needs to be viewed in the context of the 1854 Kansas Nebraska Act, which established 2 territories with the provision that settlers would decide whether they entered the Union as free or slave. As Eastern Kansas was settled during the 1850s, intense competition and armed conflict developed between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. With the violence lasting from about 1854 to the beginning of the 1860s, the territory was commonly known as Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery settlers moved from neighboring Missouri, which permitted slavery, while groups such as the Massachusetts-based New England Immigrant Aid Company promoted anti-slavery settlement. Reflecting a Boston and New England perspective, this map subtly highlights the conflict. While the map's primary purpose was promotion of newly surveyed lands in eastern Kansas that were open for settlement, the marginal illustrations underscore the publisher's anti-slavery sympathies. For example, one image depicts the Lawrence's Eldridge Hotel, a haven for anti-slavery immigrants. It was destroyed in 1856 by pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri. Another illustration depicts Topeka's Constitution Hall, where an anti-slavery constitution was drafted. Land ownership maps and atlases are another excellent source, especially for examining immigrant settlements in rural areas. Such maps were first published in the 1790s as small New England town maps, then reformatted as large county wall maps by the mid-19th century, and finally appeared in atlas format for individual counties during the last third of the century. These maps displayed the names of individual landowners and located churches, schools, and industries. The atlases often included a picture section, a business directory, identifying the wealthier and more prominent citizens. By locating churches, often named according to their immigrant affiliation, and comparing family surnames with manuscript census schedules, which listed country of birth after 1850, it is possible to identify clusters of immigrant settlement. Gutenberg, located in Clayton County in northeastern Iowa, provides an example of a 19th century German immigrant community in an upper Midwest rural setting. This cluster can be documented using an 1886 land ownership atlas. It includes maps of individual townships, as well as separate maps of towns and villages, along with associated directories. Besides showing the town of Gutenberg located on the western bank of the Mississippi River, this map of Jefferson Township delineates the boundaries of individual land holdings, lists acreages of each parcel, and identifies owners' names. For example, John Walter owned about 120 acres, which was 3/4 of a quarter section. A cursory examination of the 43 family names listed in the directory for this township indicates that at least 37 or 86% were of German ancestry. In addition, the map locates several rural schoolhouses and cemeteries and one German Catholic church. The separate map of Gutenberg displays the town's street pattern and identifies major buildings. It also shows individual residences, but unfortunately, the owners' names are not indicated. However, there is sufficient evidence to suggest heavy German settlement and investment in the community. There are 2 churches identified as German Lutheran and German Catholic. Several industries were also located: a mill south of town associated with lead mining, a sawmill on the banks of the Mississippi, Gutenberg mills, and 3 breweries. The accompanying directory suggests that these industries were owned by residents with German ancestry. Street names are a further indication of the community's German heritage. In the southern part of the town, which was the most heavily developed, the street names are named for noted German personalities. Gotha, Herta, Schilder, Lessing, Violin, Herman. While in the northern part of town, the street names reflect American heroes and politicians: Polk, Washington, Jefferson, Lafayette, Jackson, and Van Buren. These maps provide ample evidence of the almost exclusive settlement in the German settlement in the area, which is confirmed by the 1880 manuscript census schedule. Of 240 households in the town, 94% were either first or second generation immigrants from various German states: Bavaria, Mecklenburg, Oldenburg, Hanover, Prussia, Saxony, Hesse, Dortmund, or other German-speaking countries: Switzerland, Austria, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg. And while these maps and census records portray a static picture of the community, each family has a story that reflects its migration journey. One example is the previously mentioned John Walter. He can be identified as a landowner in both the town and the surrounding township, and as listed in the directory as a manufacturer of boots and shoes. According to family tradition and genealogies, he came from Germany, possibly Bavaria, in 1846. Arriving in New Orleans, he worked on the Mississippi River boats for 3 years. Then he bought a farm in southern Illinois, but subsequently resettled in Gutenberg. Trained as a shoemaker, he started a shoe manufacturing business, obtaining a contract from the Union Army during the Civil War. He prospered and subsequently purchased substantial acreage in the surrounding area. He and his wife, Sophia Bamer, who was born in Westphalia, Germany, were faithful members of the Catholic Church. They had 1 daughter and 4 sons. One son stayed in Gutenberg and continued the shoe business, while 2 sons moved to Minnesota and South Dakota. And as some of you may suspect at this point, a great-grandson, John Amadeus Walter, served as the chief of the Library of Congress Geography and Map Division during the 1980s. Fire insurance and real estate atlases provide a similar resource for identifying immigrant neighborhoods in urban settings. First published for major cities such as New York, Chicago, and Boston in the 1860s, these urban atlases became standard publications for noted major cities and towns during the second half of the 19th century. Fire insurance atlases, which were prepared to assist insurance underwriters in determining their risk assessment, showed the footprint of individual buildings and were color-coded to reflect their construction material. Churches, schools, major public buildings, and factories were labeled. Real estate atlases served a similar function for real estate agents and included similar information, although most included the names of residential owners. Again, by locating churches and other social organizations associated with specific immigrant groups and comparing family names with directories and census material, it is possible to identify immigrant neighborhoods. To illustrate German settlement in an urban setting, I chose Chicago, using 4 sheets from a 5-volume real estate atlas published in 1886. Germans constituted the largest immigrant group in Chicago during the last half of the 19th century, comprising 1/3 of the city's population. German settlement began in the 1840s and 1850s and increased significantly during the last half of the 19th century. Sheets 23, 24, 25, and 26 in volume 3 depict a 1/2 square mile area consisting of 55 blocks on Chicago's north side, an area recognized as one of the city's first German concentrations. The sample area is bounded by Halsted, Fullerton, Sedgwick, and North Streets. The map sheets provide substantial evidence of German presence in this area by identifying churches, associated schools, and services. On sheet 23, there are St. Michael's, German Roman Catholic Church and Convent and School, and a German Evangelical Church. On sheet 24, there is a Second German Baptist Church and School. On sheet 25, there is Ulrich Evangelical Lutheran Church. And on sheet 26, there are two German-owned breweries, Bartholomew and Leach Brewing Company and K.C. Schmidt. It was religious and social and industrial activities such as these that helped provide cohesive lifestyles for the residents of Little Germanies that were developing in many Midwestern cities during the last half of the 19th century. Unfortunately, this atlas does not include the names of property owners, as most real estate atlases do. Thus, I needed to consult other sources to provide a better sense of the size and density of German population in the neighborhood. A quick survey of an 1881 directory confirms the large number of German residents in this area. For example, the block of Hurlburt Street, now Cleveland Street, where St. Michael's German Roman Catholic Church is located, reveals such family names as Mueller, Schaefer, Scharf, Schlemm, Schlack, Schmidt, Schmitz, Wenzel, and Wertel. Thematic maps based on census data and immigration statistics are the best graphics for visualizing the composite picture of where immigrants were born and where they settled. Unfortunately, such maps were not published in the United States until the middle of the 19th century, following the 1860 and 1870 federal censuses. Although the censuses were taken every 10 years, beginning in 1790, the place of birth was not recorded until 1850. Data referencing the 1860 slave population in the southern states was the first demographic variable to be mapped. By labeling these states as the slave states, as we often do, such terminology suggests that the enslaved, primarily of African origin, were distributed uniformly through the region. This visually striking map, which was published in Harper's Weekly, demonstrates otherwise, since it plots the density of African American population in proportion to white population based on county level data. Rather than showing a uniform distribution, it is apparent that there are several major concentrations, particularly where commercial plantation agriculture was most profitable. Tobacco in the Chesapeake to Tidewater, sugar in the lower Mississippi, and cotton across the Piedmont area of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi into Texas. The first statistical atlas devoted exclusively to mapping census data started with the 1870 census. Similar but more comprehensive atlases appeared for the 18 and 1890 censuses. Especially useful are the thematic maps presenting demographic data pertaining to the 1890 immigrant or foreign-born population. Using the Germans as an example, it is possible to summarize the broad patterns of their migration experience during the 19th century. We see that they focused in the broad area from New York and Pennsylvania across the Midwestern states into the Great Plains states of Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas and Iowa. The atlas also includes other innovative graphics characterizing the immigrant population. For example, plate 10 displays a series of pie diagrams showing percentage of foreign-born by state. Germans, who were color-coded with black, appear to have larger percentages than other immigrant groups in Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, and Missouri. And you can get a sense for several other groups, such as the Irish in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Delaware, and Scandinavians in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. While most cartographic representations of immigration statistics have been prepared as national or state maps, there are a few examples of studies that focused on individual cities or portions of cities. An example is a survey of Chicago's poorest section based on a study conducted by residents of Jane Addams Hull House. 4 maps and 10 essays were published in 1895. In developing this publication, they utilized data collected from April to July 1893 by the US Department of Labor for a larger study on urban slums. The Chicago portion was directed by Florence Kelly, who became one of the leading social activists during the Progressive period. This study area, which was located just to the east of the Hull House, encompassed 1/3 square mile, bordered by Halstead, Polk, State, and 12th Streets. Agnes Sinclair Holbrook, a recent graduate of Wellesley College and a resident of Hull House, assisted in the compilation of the maps and prepared the introductory essay analyzing the maps. She indicated that, quote, the inhabitants, as the maps show, are chiefly foreigners, and that the study area includes east of the river, a criminal district which ranks as one of the most openly and flagrantly vicious in the civilized world, and west of this same stream, the poorest and probably the most crowded section of the city. The maps were color-coded to show the percentages of each nationality residing on individual city lots, rather than the total number of residents. Consequently, the map does not reflect density of settlement, rather diversity of immigrant population throughout the study area. 18 nationalities were identified in this study area. The largest number were Italian, blue, Russian and Polish Jews, red and red stripe, and Bohemians, yellow. Germans and Scandinavians did not figure very high in this particular area. In characterizing the spatial distribution of the various nationalities, Ms. Holbrook observed that the various nationalities were more or less intermingled, but there was a decided tendency to congregate into little colonies. Now, some of you may be asking at this point, what about the Irish? I must apologize. When we scheduled this talk, I was not thinking of St. Patrick's Day, and I didn't think about it until about a week ago. But just in case you are interested, see how the Irish are color-coded in these graphics. On the pie diagram map green, and in the Hull House map green. Migration is a dynamic process and is difficult to document cartographically because most maps provide one single temporary snapshot of a particular geographic place. It was not my intention tonight to present a new interpretation of migration or of cartographic history, rather to bring to your attention a variety of maps that are useful in documenting America's migration stories. By piecing together cartographic evidence from different times and places, it is possible to reconstruct individual migration stories to gain a more complete picture of their journeys. Tonight's presentation was designed to provide further cartographic context the Newberry Library's current map exhibit, Crossings, Mapping Americans' Journeys. And as Jim indicated, it was also an abridged version of my contribution on migration mapping for the library's earlier digital content project, Mapping Movement, American History and Culture, which, as I understand, is currently undergoing redesign For further elaboration and bibliographic references to the maps and the related stories that I discussed, please refer to the updated site when it is finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That was really quite impressive. An incredible breadth of material covered in all just under an hour. I'm quite impressed that you were able to cover such an impressive span of material. So we will open things up for questions now at this time. I welcome folks to submit questions either through the Q&A section, the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, I'll be happy to pass things over so you can take the mic. Ron, one thing, what caught me, I mean, like you really went all out on this as far as the scope of your presentation is concerned, and given your background and cartographic expertise, what do you think are where do the major gaps remain as far as tracking our nation's story of migrations, apart obviously from the indigenous maps that have been lost?
I guess, okay, I'm not quite sure where the major gaps are, but let me just start with, when I first started at the National Archives, one of our technicians, who was African-American, was starting to make a list of maps that showed some sort of indication of African-American settlement. And I think he had a list of maybe about 24 maps. And now just keep in mind, that was in the 1970s. I think what is happening is people are becoming much more aware of looking at maps for this type of information, whether it's African Americans or Native Americans. They are looking for that kind of information. And I would say one of the things I'm looking at right now is a county land ownership map for Montgomery County, Maryland. And I'm looking at it in the sense of what it doesn't show, because a third of the population was slave. And since it's a land ownership map, very few African Americans are shown on that map. So I think there is much more to sort of dig in to find these kind of stories.
So it can also be a matter of taking a fresh look at previously known material as well.
Exactly.
Any other questions for Ron from the audience? I know when we were chatting a little bit beforehand, Ron, you said you had to pare this down quite a bit from your original draft. What were some of the things that you cut out that you maybe wanted to touch base on a little bit, or if you could go for another time, round two?
Well, I did sort. Oh, okay. One thing that I probably would have included, where I've done quite a bit of research, is Portuguese Americans. I work with the Library of Congress Luso Portuguese specialist, and their immigration patterns are really quite different from most of the Europeans. And most Europeans move from northeast to west. The Portuguese had sort of a bimodal pattern. They settled in southern New England as part of the whaling industry, and then they settled over around the San Francisco area, also as part of the whaling industry. So there is a pattern that is really sort of totally different from what we generally anticipate.
That's fascinating. We got a question from Andrew. If I wanted to look up other types or groups of immigrant migration, where would I look? What are some resources that folks can access for tracking Americans' migration?
Well, one that I find particularly good, and it's one that I started with when I've done most of this type of research. It's an atlas that was published in 1988 based on the 1980 census. It's called We the People, an Atlas of American Ethnic Diversity. Did I say 1880? I mean 1980. The 1980 census asked a selection of people what they considered their ethnic background to be. Now, most of the maps that you saw from the the 1890 atlas was based on people either answering that they were first generation or second generation immigrant. But this 1981 said, what do you consider your ethnic background to be? That particular atlas includes, I think, about 45 maps for different ethnic groups. And with each map, there is probably a 2 to 3 page explanation of the general patterns for that group. So I always find that a good place to start.
That sounds like a very handy guide for looking at really any kind of map. So thank you for that. We got a question from Mike, and a good one. How many 19th century immigrants actually purchased these maps? Were these pocket maps something that were in use in day-to-day operations as people were traveling to Kansas or moving westward?
Interesting question. I would sort of like to hear Jim chime in on that, because I think he has several maps and atlases in the exhibit that actually have annotations and have indications that they were being used.
Yeah, it's hard to know what percentage. I think it's very closely related to the nationality. Depends on, I think in many cases, the level of literacy and perhaps disposable income. We do have one map right in the beginning of the exhibition, which was inscribed by a German immigrant named Otto Rollman, who settled in Wisconsin in 1844, and the map is a map that he purchased in Germany, looking very much like a couple of the examples that Ron showed. So I think it was very strong among German and Northern Europeans, just based on anecdotal evidence of what I've seen in the Newberry's collection. We don't see so many for Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. But with how many people actually had maps within that group, I would think within any of those groups, fairly small percentage. But I think there's enough evidence to say that it was many people did see maps, whether or not they had actually purchased them. Often they were had access through promotional publications that companies operating railroads and transoceanic cruise shipping lines would produce. But nobody really knows for sure. That's a hard question to answer.
But that was still a pretty good answer, Jim. So thank you for that. And this one could be geared to both of you. The migration patterns obviously seem to shift with changing trends in economy, racial attitudes, a number of these different more esoteric factors. So as a result, it seems like maybe the material was more ephemeral. We've got a question from Barbara. Could you talk a little bit more about the materials that were used when you were mapping these migration stories? Were they intended to be temporary, or were they constructed with the intent to last much longer than that?
I would say it probably varies according to type of map, but I would think the travel literature probably was not meant to last a really long time. I think the paper for the maps are relatively thin, and generally they're folded into the volume. And I think if anybody has experience with 19th century maps and books and folded maps, they don't last real long, especially if they're being used. But things like the county land ownership maps or the fire insurance atlases were much more substantial publications. In the middle of the century, in the middle of the 19th century, I think it was sort of customary to hang a county land ownership map up on the wall, and it'd be sort of the the decorations or the part of the decor of your house. And interesting, you might save that question for Martin Bruckner's talk, because I think he spends time in one of his books talking about how maps got used and how maps got displayed. But now, okay, the fire insurance atlases did not have wide circulation. They were basically kept by insurance underwriters and government offices that were concerned with building construction. Although, okay, they didn't have wide circulation, they had a great utility, and they were pretty well constructed, and I think still have a fairly good state of preservation.
There were also, it's my understanding, those fire insurance atlases were quite expensive to prepare and produce. So it kind of.
Yes, they were. And since they didn't have wide circulation, that made them even more expensive.
Right.
And they would put paste up corrections on them. So an individual employee from the map company would have to go around to each subscriber and paste on the corrections. Labor intensive.
Certainly so. Any other questions for our esteemed speaker, Ron Grim, this evening? All right, well, Ron, wait, hang on, just wanted to make sure. No, I think we got them all in the Q&A. All right, well, thank you all for joining us this evening. Ron, thank you especially. Really appreciate your time and sharing all your expertise on all those beautiful maps. So it was a lot of fun ones that were really great to explore this evening. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate your time. Hope everybody has a great evening. Jim, anything else you'd like to add?
Just thank you again, Ron, and come out and see the exhibition when you can, everybody. And look forward to seeing you next month for the next installment of this series. Thank you all for coming out, so to speak, on this Thursday evening.
Absolutely. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Take care. Have a great evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.